Oh, minimize. Good morning and welcome to the students at the Jamaica School of Preaching and Biblical Studies in Kingston, Jamaica. And good morning to everyone on the internet who are on YouTube at this time or who will be later watching what is archived. Welcome to Introduction to Biblical Apologetics. Before I go on, we're going to begin our class by going to God in prayer. Father in heaven, I give you thanks for the wonderful opportunities that you've given to me and to these students here to be able to explore how we can defend the faith more effectively. Father, you can see even more than we can that the faith of our Lord Jesus is under great attack from atheists, agnostics, from people who do not want to accept the Christian faith, and even from within the church, we find that there are people who do not share the biblical worldview. We pray that you may help us to be able to make great use of this time in equipping ourselves to be able to defend the faith. And we pray that all Christians throughout the world will be able to defend the faith effectively in their different countries. In Jesus' name, amen. Now, this course started in the last trimester, and I'm continuing. The lesson today is going to be a link between what was done last term and what we are continuing to do this term. Now, this term, I'm going to be spending a few more lessons on how to refute evolution. For evolution is the theory used by atheists and agnostics about how everything in nature came to be without referring to a creator. And so we find that scientists who believe in evolution, not all of them believe in it, but those scientists who believe in it are trying to do their best, even to be dishonest, in trying to justify or defend the world around us, the universe in which we live, without any reference to a maker. And so this is why I've spent so much time looking at evolution. But it is necessary to go on to other aspects of defending the faith. So after a few lessons on evolution, I hope by the help of God to have a series of lessons on how to prove that there is a God. Not just to disprove evolution, but how do I show people who don't have any faith in a supernatural being who created everyone and everything, that there is such a being out there, that he is real, that he's not just in the Bible, but he is actually out there. Yes.
So this class is kind of like Christian evidence, right?
No difference. Yeah. It's just a difference in name.
Okay.
And thank you very much, because that has brought up something that I have overlooked. That apologetics means defense. It's from the Greek word apologia. In English letters, that is spelled E-P-O-L-O-G-I-A, but pronounced apologia. And it is translated into English as defense or answer. It is found in 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 15. It says, "Be ready to give an answer or a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason of the hope that is in you, with meekness, that is with gentleness or humility, and fear, that is with reverence or respect." And so Christian evidences and apologetics, which is defense of the faith, are really the same thing. And what used to be called Christian evidences and still is generally called apologetics today. Now, we're going to be looking at a few lessons then on how to prove there is a God. And after that, we're going to be looking at some current or modern time challenges to the faith. For example, those that support the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender program, trying to influence governments and churches and whole nations to accept their idea of these different lifestyles being acceptable. How do I tear down those arguments? Also, what is currently going on in Jamaica is the government is discussing the pros and the cons of abolishing the law that forbids abortion. And on the 30th of this month, there are going to be some church-related groups like Lawyers Christian Fellowship, the Jamaica Coalition for a Healthy Society, and some individuals that are experts in the field of medicine. Professor Bain, who is retired from the University of the West Indies, and a doctor of many years experience, Dr. Charles Royce, who was one of the founders of El Shaddai Medical Center on Hope Road. They're going to be making presentations in our Jamaican Parliament to try to persuade the government of our country here not to remove the law that forbids abortion. The United Nations and the Organization of American States are requiring and pressuring governments throughout the world to change their law that forbids abortion. Okay, so we need to be able to understand how do we tackle and overthrow the arguments that they use against us to try to push abortion on us. So that is where we're going this term. But today we're looking at lesson number 11, as you can see, entitled "The Worldwide Flood is the Key to Understand What the Fossil Record Shows Us and Why the Evolutionary Origin of Life and its development is false." Now, in that title, there are many ideas. The worldwide flood refers to the time in the days of Noah, recorded in Genesis chapters 6, 7, and 8, of how God sent a flood upon mankind, and everything that was in the dry land and breathed was drowned. Now, when it says that it is the key to understand what the fossil record shows us, we need to understand what is meant by the fossil record. A fossil is a preserved remain of a living thing that is now dead. It's no longer alive, it has been dead for a while, but it has not completely decayed. It has been well preserved by becoming a rock. And so you can see the form of the creature that used to be around and what it looked like. And it will give you some idea of what living things looked like in the past. Now, why this fossil record is important is that it is interpreted in two different ways. And I'll give you the two different ways right now. There is what is called uniformitarianism. Now think of uniform. In Jamaica, most students who go to primary school or secondary school or prep or high school wear a uniform. Everyone has the same kind of shirt and pants or the same kind of blouse and skirt. That is linked with the name of the school they attend. And there is a trend now that even when you are employed, you have some companies requiring that their employees have a uniform that belong to that particular company. Uniformitarianism is the idea that everything has remained the same from the beginning until the present. And that if you're going to understand what life was in the past and how it developed to this present time, you will have to look at what is happening today to interpret what happened in the past. They love to say that the key to the past is the present. So they use what is happening now to interpret the present. So they look at the time it takes for sediments or layers of sand and gravel and mud to build up in rivers. And so they will say, if it takes, let us say, I'm giving an example. If it takes 10 years for sediments to build up to a certain height in the riverbed or in the seabed, then they assume that the same time that was taken in the present was the same time it took in the past. And then they apply it and they say, if it took 10 years, let us say, for sediment to be built up 4 feet high from the bottom of the riverbed or from the bottom of the seabed, then that was the same time it took for 4 feet of sediment to develop. The problem with that, though, is there have been catastrophes in the past. And by catastrophes, I mean great disasters that have changed the way the world looks. Now, if you assume that what is going on now has always been going on and has never changed, it is assuming too much, because it is not taking into account that disasters have happened in the past. Now, it is based upon how long it takes for sediments to build up that evolutionists theorize that it has taken millions of years for the rocks, for what used to be sand and gravel and mud to harden, and for these dead things that are found in the rocks to have been preserved. They use what is happening now to interpret what they see happened in the past from the dead remains of plants and animals and humans. The other interpretation is catastrophism. You have uniformitarianism, that everything has been happening uniformly or in the same way, at the same rate, from the very beginning up until now. But there is catastrophism. Catastrophism means that everything has not been happening at the same rate. There have been times when the earth was greatly disturbed by unusual disasters. Take, for example, in 1980, in the United States of America, there was a massive volcanic eruption. Mount St. Helens erupted, and it formed a large crater at the top, and it also dug out a lot of ground and created a small scale of what is known as a Grand Canyon. It has a canyon that is similar to the Grand Canyon, and it happened in just a matter of hours, not millions of years. So catastrophes have happened that have changed the landscape of different countries. Things are not always uniform. There have been catastrophes. Where does this come in? Well, the worldwide flood is the biggest catastrophe that we have on record in the Bible. Because it says in Genesis chapter 7, verses 21 to 23, that all the high mountains under the whole heaven was covered with water. It also says that the fountains or the springs of the great deep were broken up. There was some earth movement that caused the water that was under the earth, under the seabed or ocean bed, to gush up. And so much of it gushed up that it covered the land. So we're not only talking about steady torrential rainfall for 40 days and 40 nights non-stop, but huge amount of water under the earth welling up from the ocean floors and causing the sea level to rise so that it covers the land. So that everywhere on the earth was covered. Now, when you have a situation like that, you will find that a lot of living things are going to be drowned, and a lot of mud and gravel and rock is going to be quickly moved over these dead things, and it is going to happen fast, and the minerals in the water are going to enter into the animal and preserve it and turn it into rock. That is what is called catastrophism, which really is saying it doesn't take millions of years for these creatures to be buried and preserved and turned into rock. It only takes a short time because of catastrophes. So these are the two different main theories that are contending each other: uniformitarianism and catastrophism. But the problem with uniformitarianism, apart from the fact that catastrophes have happened in the past, is that we know scientifically that when something dies, its body starts to decay at a rapid rate. Whether it is on the bottom of the ocean, or the bottom of the sea, or the bottom of a riverbed, it starts to decay. Number two, there are bacteria on the ocean floor that will eat up the dead organism that is already decayed. And therefore, the preserved remains of these things that we find in the rocks should not have been preserved like what they are. They are perfectly preserved, which must mean then that they were quickly buried, not slowly buried over millions of years. That wouldn't really explain how they're so well preserved. And also that their body must have been quickly mineralized or become rock for it to be preserved so well. In fact, so well have these fossils been preserved that there have been found jellyfish, hundreds of jellyfish preserved in rock. Jellyfish don't have hard substances, and they would ordinarily decay fast. Also, there are octopuses that have been found, that have been preserved. These soft-bodied creatures should not have been preserved if it took millions of years for the process of preservation to happen. Now, the traditional interpretation of these fossils in the past, before the days of Charles Darwin, is that the worldwide flood in the Bible explains how we have all these dead things in the rocks all over the world. And so geologists who study the rocks to try to find out what happened to creatures in the past, what they looked like, what they ate, they didn't have any problem accepting that there is a creator and that what they find in the rock is not really an evolution or development of living things from one-celled organisms to organisms that have many cells. They didn't have that idea because they explained the dead things in the rocks to be the result of the worldwide flood in the time of Noah. But let me tell you what happened. There was a lawyer about the time of Charles Darwin who was called Charles Lyell. Charles Lyell. I suppose the name Lyell tells us what kind of man he is. Of course, it wasn't spelled like L-I-E, but L-Y-E-L, I think. But he was a lawyer, and he said, my mission is to remove geology from Moses and explain it in a natural way. Now, when he says remove geology from Moses, what he means is, since Moses wrote Genesis and the worldwide flood is found in the book of Genesis, and traditional geologists have been explaining the dead things in the rocks to be the result of the flood described by Moses in Genesis 6, 7, and 8. And it is all based on the belief that there is a God who brought judgment on the world by a flood. My mission, Charles Lyell said, is I'm going to argue. Remember, he was trained as a lawyer, so he knew how to be persuasive. He wasn't a geologist. I am going to argue that it wasn't a worldwide flood that caused all of these dead things to be preserved in rocks, but that what we see in the rocks at the lowest level, going up to the highest level, is the story of how life originated and how it developed into complex life forms. So at the very bottom, you have the simplest life forms, and then gradually up to the top, you have it becoming more and more advanced. And it was based upon his principles of interpreting in these layers of rocks that Charles Darwin set out to prove that Charles Lyell was right by looking for evidence that it wasn't really a creator who made anything, but that life originated by chance and developed into the complex life forms that we have today. So they use the same information in the rocks that Christian geologists had used in the past to come up with a different explanation of how these living creatures were able to be buried and preserved in the rocks. So you have uniformitarianism. Everything has been going on from the beginning in the same way until now. And you have catastrophism, which says there have been times when great disasters have happened and changed the way that the landscape looks. So this is an important lesson. The worldwide flood is the key to understand what the fossil record shows us and why the evolutionary origin of life and its development is false. Before I move from the title, evolution cannot even begin to have a logical and scientific explanation for how life began. Because in the days of Charles Darwin, there was a scientist by the name of Louis Pasteur, who grew up in a world in which scientists believed that life spontaneously came about by itself from non-living matter. Because they didn't know about these microbes or these germs, these living organisms that are so tiny, your own eyes cannot see them unless you're looking through a microscope. They didn't have microscopes then, and they didn't know about germs. It was Louis Pasteur who discovered germs. And so let us say a fruit fly pitches on a dead dog. I'm sure you've seen it in life. A fly or flies pitch on a dead dog's body. And after a while, you see some maggots coming out. And so the people who didn't see the microorganism, the tiny organism that you can't see with your eyes, thought that out of this dead meat came life. Well, Louis Pasteur discovered that it is not so. You have tiny seeds that are put into the flesh, or eggs, I should say, and they germinate, and you have the maggots coming. That it is not true that life comes from non-life. So he established the scientific law that life must come from life that was there already. You cannot have life coming from that which has no life. Evolution is based on the assumption, which up until now has not been proven scientifically, that life can come from that which has no life. So evolution cannot really even begin, because it cannot explain how life came from non-life. Furthermore, as we're going to see, when you look at the dead things that are assumed to have been from millions of years ago, they look just like those creatures that are living today. The lizard, millions of years ago, supposedly, the date being set by evolutionists, look like the lizards today. The frogs, millions of years ago, look like the frogs today. The ducks, supposedly millions of years ago, look like the ducks today. There is no evidence of a gradual change as you go through the layers of rocks to show you that there was an actual evolution of that animal. There is a medical doctor who is the president of the Jamaica Coalition for a Healthy Society, Dr. Wayne West, who has issued a challenge. Show me how any organ of the body evolved. Show me what it looked like before. Because the heart has always looked like a heart. The lung has always looked like a lung. Up to now, nobody has been able to show him. And he told me personally, he said to me, Mr. Buckland, ask them, where is the previous organ that was there before the present organ? Whatever the organ is. Show me the evolutionary development of that organ. Nobody has shown him. He's a medical doctor, specializes in X-rays, radiology. Okay, so not every medical doctor or scientist accepts evolution. So we're going to be looking at the worldwide flood as the key to understand what the fossil record shows us and why the evolutionary origin of life and its development is false. Now the heading says the evidences that the living things which are now fossils were all living at the same time. So what this means is I'm going to be showing you how that these dead things that have been preserved in the rocks were not living at different times. Some millions of years, some hundreds of thousands of years ago. They were all living at the same time. So here are the evidences. A rock layer named for a specific period of time contains fossils from different time periods. Let me pause here. Remember that evolutionists are assuming that the first layer of rock is the earliest period of time. That's what they're assuming. And in the earliest period of time, these are the organisms that were around then. Then the layer above is a later period of time. The organisms that are found in this layer are the organisms that later developed. Next layer above that is still later and nearer to our time. And whatever organism they find in that layer, they think is the organisms that were around at that time. The problem is, when we look at the evidence, these different things that are found in different layers of rocks are also found where evolutionists think they should not be found. They are found mixed up together. Some organisms that were thought to be much older are mixed up together with organisms that were thought to be closer in time to our time. If they were from different time periods, they should not be mixed up together. And yet they are. So reading further, I'm still in the first paragraph, the second sentence. Fossils are being found, quote, in the wrong place all the time. End of quote. In the wrong place. It's only wrong because the evolutionists think that these organisms don't belong to that period of time. So they're trying to fit the evidence with their own interpretation, rather than allowing the evidence to show them what it really means. Okay, so that's what's happening. It's not that they're in the wrong place. It's that the evolutionists are wrong in their interpretation of the fossils in different layers of rock. And this comes from Michael Ord, who has his Master of Science in Atmospheric Science, a researcher in Earth Science, and I got it from the creation.com website entitled Fossils Wrong Place. They're not really in the wrong place. They're where they should be. It's just the interpretation of the rocks is wrong. The second paragraph says, there are vast fossil graveyards found throughout the world. Notice, it's not isolated. It is found all over the world. Sounds like a flood caused these things to happen. There are vast fossil graveyards found throughout the world, consisting of animals and plants, which evolutionists have placed in different periods of time, represented by the different rock layers. But these animals and plants from so-called different periods of time are found mixed up together. So it's not only that animals from a so-called earlier period of time are found in another layer of rock with animals from a later period of time, so-called, but there are actual graveyards. And what I mean by graveyard, just like you have Dovecot Memorial Park and you have different dead bodies buried in different plots, you have in one location, in one area, one place, different dead creatures that have been preserved, and they are all mixed up together. They're all huddled up together. And when you look at their skeleton, many of them are like this. And scientists have said that this is a typical position of an animal that is trying to breathe and cannot get air and eventually drowns. Okay, so the skeleton remains show that there has been drowning taking place, and these animals were preserved in a position that showed that they were gasping for air and couldn't get any. So there are vast fossil graveyards which evolutionists have placed in different periods of time, represented by the different rock layers. But these animals and plants from so-called different periods of time are found mixed up together. Let me emphasize to you how this really destroys evolution. How can you have one animal that supposedly evolved into another animal, and this other animal, which supposedly evolved or changed into another animal, all buried together at the same time? It doesn't make sense. If a certain animal changes and becomes another, how do you have distinct animals coming together in the same place and dying? It just shows that these animals were all living at the same time, and they died at the same time, and they were buried at the same time in an international catastrophe, the worldwide flood. So let us look at some of these fossil graveyards that have been found all over the world. In Agate Springs, I'm near to the end of the second paragraph. In Agate Springs, located in the state of Nebraska in the United States of America, there is a fossil graveyard of about 9,000 animals and plants. For example, rhinos, that is rhinoceroses, horses, camels, giant wild boars, birds, plants, trees, seashells, and fish. Question to ask also, what are seashells and fish doing in the state of Nebraska? You would find seashells on the beach, and you would find fish in the sea or in the ocean. What are they doing inland in the state of Nebraska? Sounds like a worldwide flood. These animals got caught by surprise, and everyone came together in the same place, drowned and died. You might ask, well, how come the fish that can swim in the water get drowned? Well, when you have all of that gravel and rock rolling over the fish, and all of that dirt coming over them, they're not going to get the oxygen from the water to be extracted from the water by their gills. And so you have all these different creatures supposedly evolving into another creature, and another into another creature, all buried together in the same graveyard, along with fish and seashells. Let's go to another fossil graveyard. In the Alaska and Siberia area, let me make sure you understand geographically where this is. Alaska is a very northern state. I would say it's among the most northern states in the United States on the northwest coast of the United States. And there is a narrow sea that separates them from the continent of, no, from the country of Russia. And at the northeastern section of Russia, you have the province of Siberia. So in the Alaska and Siberia area, there were found a graveyard of bears, wolf, fox, badgers, saber-toothed cat, that is cats that have long teeth protruding or coming out of their mouth, jaguar, lynx, mammoth. Mammoth is an elephant-like creature that has a lot of hair. Mastodon, horses, camel, antelope, bison, caribou, moose, elk, sheep, musk ox, yak, ground sloth, and several rodents, all buried together. So you have the tiny creatures and you have the massive creatures all buried together. And yet they are assumed by evolutionists to have been from different periods of time. That the tiny living things like the rodents evolved into creatures that are bigger. Yet they're all together in the same graveyard. Let's move on to France. In France, hundreds of thousands of marine, that is sea or ocean creatures, are buried with amphibians, spiders, scorpions, millipedes, insects, and reptiles in a fossil graveyard. Let me tell you some significance here. The evolutionists say that we human beings began as a fish in a watery substance called the primordial soup, a sea-like substance, and that we eventually evolved legs and crawled out of the water onto land and became what is called amphibians, creatures that can live in the sea and on land. And that amphibians developed into reptiles, and that reptiles developed into birds. Now look, in the graveyard in France, you have marine creatures or creatures from the sea buried with amphibians. Where is the evolution? Okay, and you have reptiles also buried with the amphibians. Where is the evolution? When one was supposed to evolve into another and the other into another. They're all buried together in this graveyard. And why are sea creatures buried in France? They're supposed to be in the sea, in the Atlantic Ocean. Why are they buried on land? Hundreds of thousands of them. Sounds like a worldwide flood. Yes. All right. Well, I'm not sure about the break because of the YouTube situation and the online audience. I'm going to have to consult with... All right, I'm going to have to consult with Brother York or Brother Kidu to find out how to deal with that, because the taping is going on right now, and I'm not sure how we can really break it up. And I already set the time on the site there, so I'm going to have to find out about that. Okay, going to another graveyard in Wyoming. That's another state in the United States of America. Alligators, fish, birds, turtles, mammals, many varieties of insects and palm leaves are buried in the Green River. Now look at this again. Fish. The evolutionists said we used to be fish, and that the fish became amphibians, and the amphibians became reptiles. But look, one of the reptiles is an alligator. And you have the alligators alongside with the fishes. The reptiles supposedly evolved wings and became birds. You have the birds along with the alligators and the fish. Something is wrong. You have turtles, mammals, many varieties of insects, and they're all together. Now, here is my argument. If these animals belong to different periods of time, and one had evolved into another, how is it that they were found buried together? That's my question. They shouldn't be found together because, yes.
No such thing as evolution.
Yes, they shouldn't be found together. If they evolved into something else, why are they found together? It just shows that there was no evolution. There was no change from a fish into an amphibian, and an amphibian into a reptile, and a reptile into a bird. There is no such thing, because these different creatures are found together in the same grave. Fossilized, preserved remains of these creatures. Now I'm moving on to another point. My first point was, we're looking at evidences that these living things, which are now fossils, were living at the same time. My next point is, we're looking now at evidences that these living things, which are now fossils, were buried and fossilized fast. So let me take it step by step. They were rapidly or quickly buried. It couldn't have been slow, because if it were slow, the John Crow would have eaten them. If it were slow, then the bacteria would have a lot of time on their hands to decompose the flesh. And the flesh already is by nature going to decompose when the blood stops moving all over the body. So there has to be a rapid burial. And in addition to that, the remains of the body have to take the minerals from what is around it so that it can become hard, because if it remains soft for long, it will dissolve, decompose, and be not there. So both the burial and becoming rock has to happen fast. It couldn't be millions of years of burial at the present rate that mud and sand and rock are being deposited in the riverbed and the seabed and the ocean bed. It must have been because of a catastrophe like Noah's flood why these creatures were preserved so well, buried rapidly and turned into rock rapidly. So let us look at the evidences. First paragraph. All around the world, in rock layer after rock layer, there are billions of dead things that have been buried in water-carried mud and sand. Their state of preservation, meaning that they have been protected from decomposing, frequently shows that there had to be rapid burial and fossilization, that is turning the body into rock and still preserving the shape of the body, just like one would expect in the flood of Noah's time. Notice, it is found all around the world, not just in the Middle East and not just in the area where Noah lived in the Euphrates, Tigris River Valley, Mesopotamia. It is found all around the world. There must have been a worldwide catastrophic event that caused these creatures to die and to be buried quickly and to be turned into rock-like substances quickly, that today we can see what they look like. Second paragraph. There is abundant evidence that many of the rock layers were laid down quickly, one after another. And notice this, I have capitalized the words so that you may understand the importance of this. Without significant time breaks between them. Without significant time breaks between them. What I mean by that is, evolutionists customarily will say that there are millions of years between this layer of rock and the layer of rock immediately above it. Now, what has been noticed is that the evidence shows that there must have been a rapid movement of the dirt, of the sand, of the gravel, of the rock, and there must have been a hardening of the rock quickly, and another layer placed on top of the other layer without much time passing before that happens. Rapid movement and solidification of the rock, one after the other. Preservation, now here are the evidences that this must have been laid down quickly, one after the other. Preservation of animal tracks. When there is erosion of the rocks and you can see what is underneath the rock between one layer and another, what has been noticed is you have animal tracks. You know, just like how a dog will be walking in the dirt and you can see the paws imprinted, or just as how a human being will have their footprints in the sand or in the dirt. Well, in the rock, there are preservation of animal tracks. Also, there is preservation of ripple marks. Ripple meaning you have some wave-like movement. And although there is no longer any wave-like movement, it is like you capture it in a photograph. It is right there imprinted in the rock. When there has been, you can see underneath the rock, between one layer of rock and the other, you see that there are some movement of what was water, but is now rock. That has been preserved. In order for that to be preserved, there must be rapid burial. Even raindrop marks. I've seen it in pictures on the internet. Even raindrop marks are imprinted in the rock. Of course, it wasn't rock originally. It was dirt and sand, but even raindrop marks are preserved in the rocks. And this testifies to rapid covering of these features to enable them to be preserved so that we may see them today. Now, many of the same fossils remains are not in one layer of rock alone, but their preserved remains are in many different layers of rock. Let me give you an illustration from last trimester. It is common to see tree trunks standing up straight, and they are found in different rock layers. The same tree, the trunk is now rock, it has become petrified, and it goes through different layers of rock. Now, this could not be from different periods of time. And the layers of rock that the tree trunk goes through would not fit that it is from different periods of time. It's the same tree. You see, so it shows that it was laid down at the same period of time, and not that it belongs to different periods of time. So it shows that the different layers of rock are not different periods of time, but the same period of time in which these living things, trees and animals, lived. Okay, I'm showing evidences that these living things, which are now fossils, were buried and fossilized first. I will soon speak about this rock here. It has an interesting feature. These are people at the bottom to show you how high the rock is. These are people at the bottom. Yes. The scarcity of erosion. Now, it takes some period of time for rocks to erode. For example, the sand that you have on the beach. Where did that come from? The action of the waves eventually wore out the rocks, and some of the rocks broke off into smaller particles to form sand. Okay, so it takes a while for that to happen. But when you look at the rocks, there is hardly any erosion. So there is not much time that happened in the laying down of one layer upon another layer. There is hardly any formation of soil between one layer of rock and another. There is hardly any animal burrows. You know, some animals bore holes in the rock, or in the dirt rather, and hide their young ones, or they may live there. There are hardly any of that. Not enough time for that. Also, the roots, there are hardly any roots between layers of rock. So all of this shows that they must have been deposited in quick succession, one after the other, Now look at how this rock is bent over. Now, there is no sign of melting, like in a volcanic action. No sign of the rock having melted. There is no evidence of cracking or breaking up. You know, rocks will break if they are hard when they're being bent by some movement of the earth. They would break. But look at this rock. It goes over like this. This is what you call a fold rock. It folds over. It wasn't always hard, but it's evidence that this is vast amount of mud that was being pushed by a large body of water, which was moving quite fast, which caused the mud to bend over and later to harden into a rock. Now it's exposed to erosion right there. So the radical deformation of thick layers of sediment, like what you see here, one layer above another, the radical or great or severe deformation of thick layers of sediment without evidence of cracking or melting also shows that all the layers must have been still soft when they were bent. What is all of this showing? A whole lot of water. And the water is moving a lot of mud, dirt, sand, particles of rock. Now, we're looking now at recent observations and experiments that show that long periods of time are not necessary to explain the fossil record. When I was a student studying geography in high school, the textbook was saying that it took millions of years for plants that died and were buried to form petroleum. And I didn't know better in those days, and I didn't harmonize it with the Bible. I just took it like it was so. They should know what they're talking about. But let us look at some recent experiments that show that it is not necessary to say that a long period of time took place for fossil fuels to form. But before I get there, here is an interesting finding. In the first paragraph, it says there are many examples of rock forming rapidly. A clock, a spark plug, and keys have all been found in sedimentary rock. What does that tell you? It tells you that this rock that they found, having a clock, a spark plug, and keys, formed recently. And it didn't take millions of years to form. Clocks have not been around for millions of years. That's a relatively recent invention. Spark plugs, which are needed in engines like motor cars or trucks or buses, that's not millions of years ago. That's recent. So these show that the rock was formed recently. John Whitmore, who has his PhD and who is professor of geology, said, long periods of time are not required to harden rock. Now remember, this man is a professor of geology. Geology means the study of rocks. He says long periods of time are not required to harden rock. The reason I'm emphasizing this point is that evolutionists assume that it takes millions of years for rocks to form. But it doesn't. Sedimentary rock generally consists of sediment, such as mud, sand, or gravel, that has been turned into rock. Now here is an evolutionist himself. It's very good when an evolutionist can admit something that does not support evolution. Now here is an admission. I'm not sure if he realized how he undermined his own belief in evolution, but here is what he said. Dr. Philip Curry admitted that fossilization can take, quote, a few hours. A few hours. If the groundwater is heavily laden with minerals in solution, the process can happen rapidly. Well, when you have the fountains of the great deep being broken up from the ocean floors or the seabeds, a whole lot of minerals will be in that water. And this evolutionists admitted that if the groundwater has a lot of minerals in it, then the process of fossilization, that is turning a dead thing into a rock, can happen rapidly. Continuing on that point, recent observations and experiments have shown that long periods of time are not necessary to explain the fossil record. Fossil fuels do not need millions of years to form. In December of 2013, it was published, and here's a quotation: "Scientists at the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory are claiming success in perfecting a method that can transform a pea-soupy solution of algae into crude oil by pressure cooking it for about 30 minutes. Now let me ensure that you are still with me. When he says pea-soupy, he's talking about it is in a water, the green substance called algae, which floats on water, is in water, and it might be thick because it is compared to like a pea soup. But when it is pressure cooked for half an hour, it can turn into crude oil. Amazing. 30 minutes. And yet the evolutionists are saying that it takes millions of years for crude oil to form from dead and decaying plants. Well, this experiment shows it doesn't have to take such a long time. Now, the process called hydrothermal liquefaction also works in other streams of organic matter, such as municipal sewage, that is waste matter from a town. The crude oil created is lightweight and low in sulfur and can be dropped into refineries that process fossil crudes. Let's go on to the next paragraph. Yes.
But sir, somebody asked, what about the dinosaur fossil remains? What do you think about that?
Fine. The dinosaur fossil remains is an excellent argument to use with evolutionists. Now, the evolutionists think it is an excellent argument to use with us. But in the 1990s, and creation.com has a wealth of information about it, there is an evolutionist who is a researcher in geology by the name of Mary Schweitzer. She's Dr. Mary Schweitzer. She's still around. She made a startling discovery in the decade of the 90s. She discovered dinosaur blood. She discovered dinosaur blood cells. She discovered dinosaur veins or blood vessels. She even discovered dinosaur DNA. Now, when she saw this and she published it, the evolutionists strongly criticized her and told her that this could not be correct. The evidence you have presented must have been contaminated. It is not reliable. She herself didn't like it because she is an evolutionist and she has not given up her evolutionary belief because of this. And so she decided to test it further. And she found it was not contaminated. And she herself admitted, how is it that I can find blood in the dinosaur fossil when blood doesn't last long? You know, it quickly hardens up, coagulates, and disappears. It doesn't last long. It just shows that the dinosaur could not have died out, as evolutionists say, 65 million years ago. They say dinosaurs ceased to exist at the latest 65 million years ago, long before human beings were here. Human beings were here, they say, just 100,000 years ago. So when you say 65 million years ago, that's a long time. Now, the presence of blood vessels, DNA, which is the instructions for how the whole body should operate, you wouldn't find that if it were 65 million years old or older. You wouldn't find it. It just shows that dinosaurs did not die such a long time ago. They didn't die such a long time ago. Furthermore, this is not Mary Schweitzer now, but other persons have discovered grass in the stomachs of dinosaurs. Now, why this is so important is that evolutionists believe that grass did not evolve until millions of years after dinosaurs became extinct. What then is grass doing in the belly of a dinosaur?
Because they say dinosaurs eat different things than grass, because grass wasn't around back then.
Yes. So what is grass doing in the belly of a dinosaur? So dinosaur is a powerful argument. There are actually a lot of powerful arguments, articles written on this website, creation.com. If you type in creation.com and you get there and you type in dinosaurs, you'll get hundreds of articles about dinosaurs and what they have found to show that they didn't die out 65 million years ago. Another thing is, archaeologists have found drawings of dinosaur-looking creatures in caves. Now, how did these people know what a dinosaur looked like? The very name dinosaur was not even around back then. It was created in the 1840s. It means terrible lizard. What they used to call these creatures in ancient times is dragon. That's what they used to call them, dragon. And archaeologists also have found that there are in different countries stories about human beings fighting dinosaurs, like St. George and the Dragon in England. So history shows that dinosaurs and human beings have been together for a while. And I'm going to say something that might be startling. I have found evidence from what has been discovered in islands near the Philippines. They have actually seen the natives or the people who live in that region, the Philippine area and Indonesia area, they have actually sighted creatures that resemble the dinosaurs that scientists talk about. So there might be few of them still around today. Okay, so, and that won't be anything new, because there was a fish called the coelacanth that the evolutionists said died out millions of years ago, and recently they found the same fish swimming about in the sea, and it looked exactly like the coelacanth that was fossilized in the rocks. They thought the coelacanth, a kind of fish, was extinct. So it might be that they might find dinosaurs that are still around in that area. So dinosaurs don't really prove evolution. it really supports what the Bible teaches and the frame of time that creation has been around. Any further question or comment on the dinosaurs?
I think the dinosaur, back then when the international flood happened, I think they died out because of that too.
Okay.
I think
many of the creatures died, but remember that Noah was told to take a sample of the animals onto the ark. The evolutionists might laugh and say, Mr. Buckland, how can you bring those gigantic creatures onto an ark? Well, it has been found that when the dinosaur is a teenager, it is small. And it is later on that it takes on growth spurts and becomes big. And also, the evolutionists may not say to you, but a lot of the dinosaurs were not gigantic. Many of them were small creatures. You had gigantic dinosaurs, but not all of them were gigantic. So teenage dinosaurs or younger could have been taken onto the ark, and later after the ark, they reproduce. So I wouldn't say that they were all wiped out of the flood.
Okay. They could.
Yeah.
It might not happen, but they could.
All right, because God wanted each creature to be preserved.
Mm-hmm.
So we know that many creatures were wiped out of the flood. Many of them repopulated the earth after the flood. Okay, but dinosaurs do not prove the long period of time that evolutionists say that has existed.
And maybe the number is not correct. 65 million years ago, they don't know what happened back in 65 million years.
Well,
or if 65 million years ago. You know what I mean?
Yes.
Because I don't think the earth was even that old.
Well, according to the Bible, it says in 6 days, the Lord made the heaven and the earth and the sea and all that is in them. And on the seventh day he rested. Exodus chapter 20, verse 11. And the day is defined in Genesis chapter 1 by evening and morning. Evening being the period of darkness, morning being the period of light. And you have about 12 hours of darkness and 12 hours of light. So 12 hours plus 12 hours give you how many hours? 24 hours. The problem with evolutionists, I'm going to tell you something else that I didn't say before. They're not being fair. Because what they say is this, and remember this, never forget this. They say that even if they find evidence to support that there is a God, they're not going to accept it. They have said it straightforward like that. They say we're not going to accept, even if all of the evidence were to point to a creator, we will not accept it. Now, if you start out with that view, you will never accept it unless there is a change of heart. So it's not like they are honest and impartial, looking for the truth. What they're looking for is evidence that they hope will support their view, that everything happened naturally and there was no supernatural creation. They're looking for proofs, and that is why they don't accept the evidences that are presented to them that show there is a God, and they try to get another story to explain why what they said did not really harmonize with what was found. Mary Schweitzer herself, who made this discovery about dinosaur blood and blood vessels and stretchy tissue in the bone, stretchy tissue still in the bone, she has not given up evolution. She has not given it up. See? Okay. Now, looking at the second paragraph, the technology described as one that mimics nature. Notice mimic means to imitate. Imitate what happens around in nature. Produces oil in much the same way that nature produces oil, but it is completed in around 30 minutes instead of millions of years. And that's from another source. Okay, recent observations and experiments have shown that long periods of time are not necessary to explain the fossil record. As is now well known by most geologists, wood can petrify rapidly. Petrify means to become rock. So wood can turn into rock rapidly. Several laboratory experiments have devised ways in which this can be done, mirroring or reflecting natural settings. Second paragraph. In the fossil record, there are copulating frog hoppers. Now get this. There have been found a male frog hopper. Now I don't think these are frogs. They might be related, but they're called frog hoppers. And I've actually seen pictures of them. They have been in a mating position, having sexual relations, and they're still joined together. And their bodies have been well preserved in the rock in that position, different ones of them. Suddenly caught off guard and buried rapidly and died in that same position of having sexual relations. And what this shows is they had to have been fossilized quickly for them to be found in the same position of having sexual relations and be well preserved. I mean, they're so well preserved. It's like they were doing it right there just now. Well preserved. Third paragraph, 5 octopus fossils have been found in Lebanon. Lebanon is a country to the north of Israel. All 8 arms, muscles, suckers, and ink. If these were not buried and fossilized quickly, they could not have been preserved. It is known that the ocean floor is teeming with or full of bacterial life, which could have eaten the octopuses had they not been quickly buried and fossilized. There is something else. Charles Darwin predicted, and he was the one who made evolution popular, that you're not going to find fossils of soft-bodied creatures in the rocks. And it would be a logical thing for him to say, because he believed that the rocks were formed over millions of years, only gradually. So soft-bodied creatures would have decayed a long time and would not have been preserved. Then how do you explain octopuses being so well preserved? And they don't have soft body parts. They don't have hard body parts. And how do you explain that they were not eaten by bacteria? They must have been buried quickly and turned into rock quickly. So how do we bring all of this together? The worldwide flood in the time of Noah explains the fossil record, not evolution. The fossils show that there was cancer of the bone, teeth marks, and signs of drowning. In other words, these animals fought each other. When God created the animals in the beginning, they were not made to eat one another. In Genesis chapter 1, verses 29 to 30, they were told to eat vegetables and plants and fruits.
So all of them were herbivores.
Yes.
Huh.
So they were not at that time in the beginning vicious and violent and were turning on each other and clawing and scratching each other and biting each other. They were creatures that would eat vegetable matter. And human beings at the time would eat vegetables and fruits. There were no carnivorous animals, and humans were not eaters of flesh in the beginning. What happened is, after sin came into the world, it not only badly affected human nature, so that not long after Adam and Eve sinned, you had the first murder taking place. Adam's son Cain killing his brother Abel. But you have animals eating and destroying each other. Sin had a bad effect on the whole nature that God made. And death came into the world as a result of sin. Now I'm saying this to try to establish a time frame for the flood, for these fossils. It was not that these animals were killed before Adam and Eve were created. Because when God created everything, he said in Genesis 1 verse 31, it is very good. Now you can't say that cancer is good, yet some of these fossils have cancers. And God said that his creation, not just humans, was very good. They were not creatures that turned on each other and fought and ate each other. They were to eat vegetables. The fossils show rapid burial and fossilization. The fossils show that different living things, which evolutionists place in vastly different periods of time, were all found mixed up together in graveyards all over the world, indicating that all these living things were living at the same period of time. This drowning, rapid burial, and fossilization could not have happened before sin and death had entered the world. You remember Romans chapter 5 verse 12 says, by one man sin entered into the world, and what else entered? And death by sin. And so death passed upon all men, for that all have sinned. But it not only affected humans, it affected nature in general. For Paul said in Romans chapter 8, verses 20 to 22, we know that the whole creation groans and travails in pain together until now. And that against their own will they were subjected to futility or vanity. In other words, they were subjected to decay, to death. So sin affected not only humans, but all of creation. And so all of these things that we find in the rocks did not die before sin and death entered the world. They died, obviously, after sin and death had been in the world, in the time of Noah. Yes.
So, sir,
Yeah.
my understanding from that is that not because human beings sin, right? It doesn't mean that animals sin, right? They didn't sin, but their nature, based on what they eat, it became different for the carnivores and, well, the herbivores, they remain herbivores, and the carnivores, and some animals became carnivores, well, because of sin, right? That's what you say?
Well, yeah, sin had a bad effect on nature. For example, in Genesis 3, verses 16 to 19, when God said to the woman, you will have great pain when you get pregnant and when you give birth. Great pain and sorrow. To Adam, he said, you have to work much harder in order to get food from the land. It will produce thorns and thistles, but you're going to have to sweat to get food from the land. So the ground is cursed. So we find that something happened to nature as a result of sin that not only affected humans, but affected the world in general. So in general, the world was subjected to death. Death entered the world and affected not only us, but everything around. Yes, yes. Okay. All right. Now, I'm going to be going on to a discussion of what we were discussing. There are two scientists that are going to be coming on the screen now, and they're going to be discussing how the global flood tells us that these living things that have now died and have been preserved in the rocks is not teaching us about how life started and developed to the present, but these are living creatures that have died and whose remains have been preserved because of a worldwide catastrophe known as the flood of Noah's time. So I now present Richard Van Grad and Calvin Smith, two scientists from Creation Ministries International. How can I make it louder? All right. Done.
Creation Magazine Live. My name is Richard Van Grad. And I'm Calvin Smith. Now, this week on Creation Magazine Live, our topic is fossils, evidence that something happened quickly. Right. Now, as we mentioned, many people have the idea that fossils are evidence of things happening slowly over millions of years. Why do they think that?
Why do people think that? Well, it's because whenever people are taught about facts that pertain to events that happened in the past that relate to the origins debate, then they're almost always taught from a certain point of view, a specific story about history. Of course, the only real choices are from either a biblical creationist viewpoint or evolutionary viewpoint, and almost all of our state-run schools teach evolution. So most people have only ever heard that way of interpreting the facts we all observe. So even many Christians simply try to add the evolutionary timeline to the Bible.
So that's why they think
that's why they think that.
So people think fossils are very old because of what they have been taught. For example, here's a picture from a textbook teaching how fossils form. You can see the diagram. Almost everyone has seen a diagram like this. You might be familiar with this from a textbook showing the average way fossils form. The text says, 1, a fish dies and it sinks to the bottom of a lake.
Right, and even though a lot of species we see in the fossil record would float, not just float to the bottom or whatever.
Squishy.
Yeah.
Never mind that for now. Okay, the second panel says, number 2, the fish rots and only the bones are left and the fish is covered with mud. And then the last panel, number 3, says millions of years pass and the mud turns to rock. Over time, the bone matter is completely changed into mineral matter. The fish is now a fossil. Those are the labels there.
Right, so notice the sequence here. The fish is first covered with mud. And then it's supposedly after millions of years that the mud turns to rock.
Okay.
Millions of years pass and the mud's turned to rock. That's what it says. So you definitely get the idea that the fossil forms over millions of years.
Yeah, but that doesn't make any sense. Unfossilized bones are not going to stay intact when they're in contact with wet soil filled with microorganisms, with decomposers and such. Yeah. The bones would have to be permineralized quickly to protect them. And the idea of slowly making a fossil is pretty silly when you really think about it. And yet almost every student in our public schools have seen it, have seen pictures like this, and have accepted it as science.
Yeah. Well, here's another one from an exhibit at the Tyrrell Museum in Alberta, in Canada. This is a world-class museum, same idea. Fish swimming along, fish has a heart attack or something, and then it falls to the bottom and gets covered over slowly, and voila, you get a fossil.
Yes, the same inference. Now, one of the main reasons the idea of fossils, the idea of fossils forming over millions of years was embedded into the minds of students is because of the concept of uniformitarianism.
We've discussed this several times before, but of course,
yes.
Just to refresh your memory, or if this is new to you, in the early 1800s, 1830 or so, a lawyer turned geologist named Charles Lyell wrote a book called Principles of Geology, which became the benchmark for understanding geology for about the next 150 years or so.
Right, yeah. Lyell's the present is the key to the past concept basically said that the way you see sediments forming in lakes and rivers and oceans today at the rates of sedimentary buildup, that has always been constant. For example, in glacial lakes, we see an annual deposit of varves, thin layers, consisting of a layer of sand and one of silt, for example. And if you add up the layers in the rock, you assume that each double layer took a year, then it would have taken millions of years to form some of these features. They're the continuous layers that we see all around the world.
Right. I remember being in school and they'd show you like Exhibit A for millions of years. And that would usually be a picture of the Grand Canyon, right?
Right.
Because you can see all of the layers fully exposed there.
Yeah.
And so then they show you that and they teach you what you just mentioned. Well, you probably, 2 varves per year and you add them all up.
And then millimeters thick, right?
Oh, yeah.
The Grand Canyon, that's over a mile deep exposed there.
Right.
You do the math, millions of years.
That's right. So it was almost like a straight mathematical equation when that concept first got proposed by Lyell. Of course, now they teach different things to students, modern geologists, and we've talked about that before. But what I find most often happens with my audiences, and you found it as well, that is if you put up that picture of the fish getting to the bottom and get covered over slowly, and say, how many people have seen this in a textbook? People put their hands up.
Yeah.
Older folks and also the younger students. So and when we get back, we're going to see how textbooks have been evolving and to keep up with the times.
Did you know that animals have genetic switches? These are regulatory regions of DNA that control the genes. Scientists have noticed that dramatic things can happen when a genetic switch is mutated. For instance, a mutated genetic switch can dramatically alter the appearance of stickleback fish or generate a great variety of coat colors in animals. Veterinary researcher Dr. Gene Leitner has suggested that God may have created genetic switches to facilitate variation, the switches having been created with the propensity to mutate without negatively affecting other traits. Modifications to genetic switches are not examples of evolution in action, even though they are often spoken of in that manner. Indeed, these changes don't involve new information, new genes arising, and evolutionists cannot explain the existence of the genetic switches in the first place. The more we learn about the complexity of genomes, the more they point to a super intelligent master programmer.
To find out more from Creation Ministries International, visit our website, creation.com.
Well, if you just tuned in this week, we're talking about fossils, evidence of something happening quickly.
Yeah.
And we were just discussing how most people think fossils take long periods of time to form because of what they got taught, especially when they were younger in school. Now, here's another textbook describing fossilization, okay? 1, an ancient crocodile dies in a river.
Okay, even though all the fossils of crocodiles look like modern day crocodiles, so they haven't evolved much apparently.
Don't be a spoil sport here. That's their story. Okay, so second panel, 2, sediments cover the body. 3, over millions of years, well, there it is again, right? Millions of years. The sediments become rock and the crocodile becomes a fossil. And 4, the rocky roads exposing the fossil.
Okay, so again, always the millions of years are stuffed in there. Here's a children's poster describing the same thing. Phase 1, death. After an organism dies, it slowly sinks to the seafloor. Phase 2, deposition. The shell gradually becomes covered with silt and sand sediment. Phase 3, petrification. Over millions of years, there we go again, the original shell becomes petrified, rock-like, and finally, phase 4, erosion. Millions of years later, the movement of the Earth plates exposes the fossil, blah, 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 and et cetera, et cetera.
So it's just constant reinforcement of fossils forming over millions of years. It's just drilled into your head. So, you know, I found a children's book on Amazon called Fossils Tell of Long Ago. And I was just astonished at the boldness of this millions of years indoctrination. I mean, this is a book for little kids, right? So let me read a little bit to you here. Great storytelling. Once upon a time, a huge fish was swimming around when along came a smaller fish. Now you have to picture it. It's a kid's book. It's got cartoony pictures and everything like that. So the big fish was so hungry, it swallowed the other fish whole. The big fish died and sank to the bottom of the sea. This happened 90 million years ago. How do we know? We know because the fish turned to stone. The fish became a fossil. A plant or animal that is turned to stone is called a fossil. So they know it's 90 million years old because it's a fossil.
So this happened 90 million years ago?
Yeah.
How do we know? We know because the fish turned to stone. Good grief. How can they get away with this stuff? Now, the big problem with these stories, because that's what they are, they're stories, is that if you try to combine uniformitarian ideas of sediment slowly forming over millions of years around a creature that could only last a few hundred years at most, if unprotected in the ground, it just doesn't work. The creature would quickly be devoured by fish, by crabs, by bacteria, et cetera, long before it could be covered and preserved and then become a fossil.
Right. So now, some of you might think that creationists don't have much to say in influencing the scientific community, but actually we do. You know, there have been enough people taught the absurdity of these stories about fossils forming slowly that evolutionists have actually been embarrassed enough to change their stories because of it. And here's some examples. In this diagram, the explanation is as follows. Bear kills the animal. The skin, organs, and flesh are eaten by the bear and scavengers. The soft body parts, such as skin and muscles, rot away. The skeleton falls apart. The bones and teeth remain. Before the bones break up in the sun, the river rises and covers them with a layer of sand. Minerals in the bones are dissolved away. These are replaced with minerals in the ground. This takes a very long time.
Okay, so that's where they put in the long ages, not in the sedimentary rates, but not in the rapid burial, right? Or they're saying it's rapid burial, but in the mineralization of the fossil.
Right, and from there they say that the mud built up and rock layers formed, yada, yada.
Okay, well, here's one last example. Here we see a diagram, but the explanation is kind of fuzzy. It says, number one, the animal dies and falls to the bottom of the ocean. That's pretty typical of these other drawings. Number two, it's covered very quickly with sand and mud to protect it from scavengers. Most of the body parts except the skeleton are eaten by bacteria and have dissolved away. Number three, lots of layers of sand and dirt pile up on top of the skeleton. Water is rich in minerals and the skeleton soaks up the water. The minerals attach itself to the bone and replace the actual bone. Number four, erosion and uplift eventually bring the fossil to the surface where it can be found.
So here we clearly see the mention as creationists have been doing for a long time now, that the animal gets covered quickly, but the timeline's kind of fuzzy from there. Now, when we get back, we'll look into why the story is changing, and we'll be back in just a minute.
For a more in-depth understanding of topics relating to the creation-evolution debate, the Journal of Creation contains peer-reviewed research papers that support a biblical account of creation, the flood, and the fall. One subscriber said, I always assumed that this journal would be too academic for me. Not so. I am a Christian with a very inquiring mind. With each issue, I find powerful articles that open doors and shine light on my understanding of the world. Each Journal of Creation is more than 120 pages and published 3 times a year. To subscribe, visit creation.com.
Okay, on this week's episode, we're talking about fossils, evidence that something happened quickly. Now, in the last segment, we saw how evolutionary explanations of how fossils must have formed are actually starting to switch over to more of a creationist type of explanation, what we've been saying for years. The creatures must have been buried in sediment quickly rather than slowly. It's a key feature in fossilization.
Yeah, but wait a second here. If the sediments have to bury the creature quickly, what happened to Lyle's story of sediments building up slowly over hundreds of thousands and eventually millions of years? If layers get laid down very quickly, what happened to the timeline? If you can't count the layers themselves as evidence of millions of years, then why would you believe in millions of years anyway?
Right. Some creatures like dinosaurs would have been maybe 6, 7 feet high if they were slumped over dead. That means you must have buried that creature with a massive amount of sediment all at once, so the layers that it's buried in can't count for millions of years.
Yeah, and we've shown examples of polystrate fossils before, fossils that pass through many layers of tree-like plants that are over 20 feet tall. They must have been buried very rapidly with even larger amounts of sediment. So what could do that?
Gee, I wonder, how about a big flood?
Yeah.
That would make sense. And of course, we talked about that in many previous episodes. One of them was episode 23 of season 3. It was called Neocatastrophism versus Uniformitarianism. We explained how many evolutionary geologists have swapped to neocatastrophism to explain these types of things. It just makes more sense. So they're okay with really big floods laying down the rock layers, now as long as it's not the big flood, the global flood.
Right. Yes, and we explained the massive problems with their idea of many big floods versus one big flood.
Yeah.
But there's still a glaring error here, as we mentioned in the last segments. Now they're saying that creatures were buried fast, but it's the permineralization or the fossilization process itself that takes millions of years?
Yeah, well, they have to get the millions of years in there somewhere. It's part of life, apparently. Of course, the problem you're pointing out here is that the bones that aren't fossilized wouldn't last for millions of years to get fossilized. So they must have been fossilized also quickly, buried quickly and fossilized quickly, which is another nail in the coffin for believing the millions of years. Now, we've observed things or we can ask the question, have we observed things getting fossilized over millions of years?
Well, of course not.
No, nobody's that old.
I mean, here's a quote from evolutionist Dr. Phil Curry. In his book, 101 Questions About Dinosaurs, he said the following: fossilization is a process that can take anything from a few hours to millions of years. The amount of time that it takes for a bone to become completely permineralized is highly variable. If the groundwater is heavily laden with minerals in solution, the process can happen rapidly. That's an evolutionist.
That's an evolutionist. We've used that quote before because it's so proud. It's good that he's honest and he wrote that in that book there. Here you have an evolutionary paleontologist admitting that fossils can and have been formed in hours. Now he says that it could take place over millions of years. But how can he know that?
Right.
He's observed the hours, but there's no repeatable observations to confirm the millions of years.
If you believe fossils form over millions of years, you believe it on faith, not on observable facts. So fossilization has been observed to happen very quickly given the right conditions. For example, 5 Japanese scientists published an example of rapid petrification after studying a small lake in the crater of Tateyama, a volcano in central Japan. A mineral-rich solution gushes from the bottom and fills the 15-meter pond with steaming acidic water. And of course, it cascades over the edge as kind of a waterfall.
Okay. Yeah, the scientists found that the naturally fallen wood, the wood that fell naturally into the overflow, was hard and heavy because it was petrified with a mineral called silica. Yet the wood was less than 36 years old, this wood that they first found. So as an experiment, they fastened fresh pieces of wood in the lake with wire, and after only 7 years, the wood had turned to stone.
That's right.
Amazing.
So really their study, clears away a powerful objection to believing the Bible.
Yes.
It means that the rocks and fossils we find on the earth could easily have formed in the 4,500 years since Noah's flood.
Yeah.
And conditions would have been favorable for petrification because there was plenty of volcanic activity and mineral-rich water at the time. And we'll be back.
Half a century ago, Nobel Prize-winning biologist Sir Peter Medawar made a startling comment. He declared that the survival of a child in a mother's womb contradicted immunological laws. Since the immune system normally detects foreign tissue and attacks it, you'd expect the mother's immune system to attack the genetically distinct child within her. Well, we now know that it actually does, but the baby survives by putting up a very specific defense. researchers at the Medical College of Georgia discovered that mammalian embryos produce a special enzyme that suppresses the mother's killer T cell action. A human embryo starts to produce this enzyme just before it attaches to the mother's uterus. This refutes a major argument used to support abortion, that the embryo is just a part of the mother's body to do with as she pleases. The research clearly shows that the human embryo is distinct from its mother from the beginning.
To find out more from Creation Ministries International, visit our website, creation.com.
On this week's episode, we're talking about fossils, evidence that something happened quickly. Let's take a look at some fossils that are definitely evidence that something happened quickly. Let's start with some copulating frog hoppers. Yes, you heard correctly. The earliest record of fossilized copulating insects has recently been unearthed in China. In sediments from the Middle Jurassic, given the evolutionary dating of the rocks. Two obvious implications of this discovery is the quality of the fossils preserved, which points to rapid burial. And secondly, the creatures remained essentially unchanged over the alleged 165 million years. That's apparently how old they are. The mating position and overall behavior, as well as the genital symmetry, are just the same as in frog hoppers today.
Well, they were certainly fossilized pretty quickly.
Okay.
Rudely interrupted by a big flood, I'd say. But anyway, here's another one. In November 2011, researchers uncovered the remains of some 80 baleen whales on the west coast of northern Chile. 20 of the specimens were complete, and they also found dolphins and a sperm whale, all mixed up together.
A lot of whales.
Yeah.
So paleontologists were thrilled to find this treasure trove, describing it as very unusual. Lead scientist and paleontologist Nick Pennison thinks the whales all died more or less at the same time after they were trapped in a lagoon. Others suggest they became disoriented and beached themselves.
Yeah, well, that's a lot of disoriented whales and dolphins.
Yeah.
But and they all got buried very rapidly before they rotted away. And the amount of sediment must have been incredible. I mean, it sounds like a big flood.
Whales, yeah.
Now, how about this? 5 octopus fossils, supposedly 95 million years old, were recently discovered in Lebanon. They were surprised that the octopuses were even fossilized. I mean, octopuses have no hard parts other than a beak.
Right.
And one report said fossilizing an octopus was as unlikely as capturing a fossil sneeze.
And they were exquisitely preserved. All 8 arms, traces of muscles, and the rows of suckers that they have were visible. Remarkably, a few of the fossils even showed remnants of ink. It's amazing. Now, when an octopus dies today, it decomposes into a slimy blob and disappears within a few days. For an octopus to be fossilized, it would need to sink to the ocean floor and remain there without decomposing or being consumed by bacteria while being buried by sediment. How could such a process be possible to produce? How is that possible? How could that possibly produce an octopus fossil, that kind of a process?
Well, the lead author of the report actually said the luck was that the corpse landed untouched on the seafloor. The seafloor was free of oxygen and therefore free of scavengers. But lack of oxygen it's no preservative.
Yeah.
I mean, experiments with fish carcasses show that even in the absence of oxygen, they still disintegrate on the ocean bottom.
Sure.
And other scientists have published research showing that the ocean floor is actually teeming with bacterial life. So these scientists haven't, explained this remarkable preserved fossilization anyway.
Yeah, and no surprise, the specimens look very much like modern octopus today. As one report announced, these things are 95 million years old, yet one of the fossils is almost indistinguishable from living species.
Right. So we almost always have the same pattern, right? Rapid burial, rapid fossilization, lots of sediment. Now, some are just going to say, well, look, examples of rapid petrification don't prove the world is young. And they're right? It doesn't prove it.
Fair enough.
But they do prove that millions of years are not needed, as evolutionary articles so often imply.
Right.
And so it destroys a false objection to accepting biblical history. There is no excuse for people not to accept biblical history.
Yeah. Why is all of this important? Because if the fossil record took millions of years to form, then the Bible is wrong about the history of the earth and the life on it. Fossils show death And if death existed millions of years before there was people, then the Bible is wrong when it indicates that these bad things are part of the curse on creation, which only came about because of the rebellion of the first man, Adam, against his creator.
That's right. But according to the book of Genesis, there was a global catastrophe, a worldwide flood, which by implication was capable of burying billions of creatures rapidly in sedimentary layers.
Right.
So reasoning from Scripture, that's where we start first. That's what our history is about.
Yep.
We would expect that most fossils were formed by rapid processes after Adam's sin, and that's just what the facts indicate.
Are you skeptical about Christianity? Perhaps you're a Christian but know someone who won't consider Christianity. Christianity for Skeptics is one of CMI's most popular books. Written by Drs. Steve Kumar and Jonathan Sarfati, this powerful resource refutes many attacks on the Christian faith. It contains cutting-edge research, solid theology, and a summary of the Christian roots of science. Questions about Islam, atheism, suffering, evidence for God, and more are answered. Full of bright, catchy illustrations and a sleek, modern style, this book draws in any reader. Purchase this resource and many others at creation.com.
Welcome back. This is...
Can turn on the light for me, please? Thanks. Okay, so this is most of the video about showing that fossils do not take a long time to form, and that the best explanation for the presence of fossils in the different rock layers is that they all lived at the same time and were destroyed in the worldwide flood of Noah 4,500 years ago. And that therefore, it doesn't really show the origin of life and its development as evolutionists claim, but it shows God's judgment on the world in the time of Noah. So the fossils do not prove evolution. And John Calvin and Richard Van Grad keep on saying in their discussions that there is no change between the fossil and its living descendant today. They look the same. No evolution, no change has taken place. Now, this is the end of the lesson on the worldwide flood is the key to explain the fossils and the rocks. Next week, God willing, we will look at arguments that evolutionists use to try to disprove creation. After a few lessons on evolution, I will go to another aspect of apologetics, and that is we will spend a few lessons showing reasons we may believe in God, not just through the Bible, but through science. And after that, we will look at some current issues like LGBT issues and also abortion issues that are being promoted by the United Nations and how we can deal with them. Okay, this brings us to an end of this lesson today. I thank the viewers for joining us on YouTube, and I thank the students at the School of Preaching for their attention, even though it has been a long class. God bless you all. Next week, same time, we will continue to look at Introduction to Biblical Apologetics.